This first part of color perception is just going to be some background and basic information. I have a quote here from an expressionist artist and art teacher, Joseph Albers, who is quoted as saying, "In perception, a color is almost never seen as it really is, as it physically is. There is not another, I think, aspect of perception that makes it quite as clear as color vision, that what we are seeing is the psychological interpretation of the environmental world." When we look at the physics of the visual world of color, we are looking at wavelengths, and how we interpret those wavelengths is dependent not just on the cones, how many cones, and all of that, and then what's going on in the cortex and our interpretation of something like that gold white versus black blue dress, where perhaps we have different expectations of the lighting, and we're doing this kind of color constancy, and we're doing that differently than other people individualistically, but also just the context in which that wavelength is being presented. And so you might not be surprised. So Joseph Albers was an expressionist artist, and he was one of those people who looked at a lot of boxes and just geometrical figures. For a long time, I thought these people were, what were they really doing? They're drawing squares. But the more I have learned about Mark Rothko, Joseph Albers, and some of these other expressionist artists and what they were trying to do, you can see what Albers is doing is he is playing with color in a very artistic kind of manner. And I know you're going to believe me when I tell you that the punchline here, if I ask you about the square that's up in the center top versus the square that's down in the center bottom, that those squares, well, if I ask you what do they appear the same, most people would say they do not appear the same. To me, the top one appears kind of orangey, and the bottom one appears kind of browny. But actually what's happening with the wavelength of what's the stimulus, environmental stimulus from the world, that's the same exact wavelength being reflected into our eyes. And the reason they look different is because the interpretation is going to be different depending on the context. And context is just one example of what's influencing our interpretation of color. So again, this is something that's going on in the mind, and this is a psychological experience. Just as all perception is, it's just really, really clear with color vision. I'm going to start out with these questions, and I'm going to end up with these questions, and usually at the end I ask students to answer these questions, and obviously that's not going to happen this time around unless somebody decides right now that within the next, because I probably won't completely finish color vision on Wednesday, Thursday, that you want to go ahead and email me an answer. I will read your answer on the next video, or the video after that, because it's much more fun if other people are playing along. But if I ask the question, what does color vision or color perception do for us? What physical attributes of the object influence its perceived color? What physical attributes of an object's environment influence its perceived color? We were just looking at that. We're going to keep talking about that. And how can we describe our color experience? Or how would you describe your experience of color? Whether that is to someone else, if you're just trying to figure out, are we seeing the same thing when we're seeing red? Or to somebody who is maybe blind and has never had an experience of color, how would you describe that experience? And as some of this background, I'm just going to repeat what we actually did at the very beginning, but now since we had that hiatus where we discussed the various different sensory modalities, it's a really good idea to go back to what is the stimulus in vision. It is electromagnetic radiation. If you remember, that is what gives us our light. And we know that it travels as a wave and that it is made up of particles, of photons. And at this point, when we talk about color vision, we're going to talk about it even more so as a wave, as what is causing our perception of color are aspects of that wave. So the amplitude or the height of the waveform gives us our perception of brightness. So how much light is being shown off of something is one aspect of the brightness of a color. And then the wavelength, the distance between the peaks, gives us our perception of color, or really a better way to say it is hue, because pretty soon I'm going to be talking about chromatic colors versus achromatic colors. And so when we talk about color as the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, I just did that. Did I do that in the right direction? Righty bib. When we're talking about colors, those are really the hues, the chromatic colors, and what's important there is the distance between the peaks. And so the longer that wavelength, the more red, yellow on that end of the spectrum, and the shorter that wavelength, the more blue, indigo, violet we become. And then the purity, or the mix of the wavelengths. So this is the perception of saturation, or really the richness of colors, which I'll try to show an example of trying to distinguish between amplitude and purity, which to some extent for me is, I'll start talking about my lack of ability with colors here in a minute, but is hard to really distinguish perceptually for me. So, but I will, as much as I can, try to make that clear. And so here I'm starting with the physics, right, the stimulus, and telling you what that translates to as aspects of our perception. And here we are looking at the electromagnetic spectrum similarly as we did before we started talking about other sensory modalities. In this case, this is flipped around, which is interesting to do, I think, after talking about hearing, because I say a lot of things about our auditory world and the auditory stimulus seem really backwards. And so when I first taught all this, it felt like this really jarring. I didn't like moving into hearing in the auditory world, but I've always been very much into music. And so you can tell my auditory world is really important to me. And I've really appreciated getting to understand some of the physics and so forth, especially in comparison to vision, which is just completely different stimulus, but we talk about them with these similar frequency versus wavelength, where the frequency is really wavelength flipped around, because it's how many cycles or how many waves per second. So the lower the frequency, the higher the wavelength. And so now we've flipped our wavelength around. We're looking at the electromagnetic spectrum. And as we stated before about this stimulus of vision, we have a teeny tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum that we get to see. And I think if we had much more of this, we would easily be overwhelmed with information. If we were seeing radio waves and microwaves, then that would be a lot of extra information. And it really feels like kind of enough information to me. And so we have our little sliver from about 400, sometimes estimated at 360, 400 to about 700 nanometers. So again, the nanometers are billionths of a meter, so really unfathomably small are these wavelengths. And as we move into shorter and shorter than 400 nanometers, we get into ultraviolet, and then X-rays, and then gamma rays. We do have some animals that are seeing the ultraviolet rays. It looks like birds, butterflies, some fish are seeing those ultraviolet wavelengths. As we get longer than 700 nanometers, we start to move into infrared waves, microwave, FM radio, TV, AM radio. And again, we have some animals that are higher than us in the spectrum that are seeing the infrared rays. Some fish, and then snakes as well. And I might put seeing infrared. The snakes, what they do is they are sticking out their tongue, right? And they're actually sensing infrared wavelengths or infrared information. But again, we have our tiny sliver, and we're not seeing the same exact sliver as the other animals around us necessarily. And so again, I'm going to flip things around where now we're talking about our perception. What are the aspects of perception of our color vision, and how does the physical stimulus translate into our perception? So this is the same exact thing as 2 slides ago, except flipped, talking about this is our perception and this is how we get the perception, just so we're doing this in both directions. The perceived color, and then I'm saying everything I want to say. The perceived color is the dominant wavelength. So as I said, usually I'm drawing this on the board and I'm making those nice sine waves the best that I can. because when you start drawing the wrinkles in the sine waves, it gets trickier to repeat the wrinkles for somebody who's not really an artist like me and doesn't actually control my hands very well. But so if I'm drawing the dominant wavelength, if I'm drawing the sine waves, remember that we're only seeing those perfect sinusoidal waves when we are looking at sunlight that is being refracted through water or through a prism or something that is creating the rainbow. There are experiments that are conducted where they have created a monochromatic wavelength light, but usually what we're seeing almost always out in the world is some mixture of waveforms, and our perceived color, when we're looking at something that appears to be blue, it's going to have a mix of wavelengths in there, but its dominant wavelength is going to be in that kind of shorter spectrum of about 450 nanometers, almost, but maybe getting towards 500 nanometers. So the longer wavelengths are red, the shorter wavelengths are violet, but those are really the dominant wavelengths. If we look at perceived brightness, so really you can think of this as how much light is being shown onto something that is red, and so how much light is being reflected versus when you're in a dimmer light, that red is going to appear less and less bright. Okay, and that is the amplitude or the height of the waveform. When I'm drawing it on the board, I usually scribble this a little bit as thicker in the marker, and then say, it's the best I can do for amplitude because I can't just change the lights for just one piece of this. And then perceived saturation is how pure versus how mixed are the wavelengths. And again, we're really not seeing those pure wavelengths very often. Usually they're mixed, and the question is, how mixed are they? And I have the example here of pink really being a desaturated red. So if we're looking at those rainbow colors, those are considered to be the saturated colors. And as we're changing those, they're becoming they're becoming desaturated. They're becoming either kind of muddier or with a mixture of wavelengths, or they're getting lighter and lighter, like we're mixing white in with them, like pink is for red. Yep, my picture falls off the screen a little bit, but we can see the last, so that last one over as we're moving from saturation, getting more and more saturated. We're moving from pink to red in the case at the top. And then what should be along the bottom is showing us pretty much brightness. So as we're moving from red, as we're getting into dimmer and dimmer light, as we move down, and then as we're moving down, we're getting less and less bright, but then we can change the saturation of that as well. And I used to not like this picture because, again, brightness and saturation are a little bit confusing to me, but and I'm gonna again keep talking about my lack of really ability with color, but so I hope that helps you all. So if we round out these basics of color vision, we can describe all colors by using the terms red, yellow, green, and blue. There are extra spectral colors, brown and purple, because those are not colors that appear on the spectrum. They're really these kinds of mixes of these other colors that are on the spectrum, where we mix them together, and so they don't really appear on the spectrum appropriately. And yes, purple is different than violet, and while, again, for me, while I can say that and I can see that they are different, if someone gives me the two colors, I can't tell you which is which, but except to say violet is one of those shortest wavelengths that are sinusoidal waveform. Purple is a mix of red and blue. But I once had a student turn to another student and say, they are just different from each other. And for a lot of people, they're just different from each other. And purple's really not on the spectrum because we're taking red and mixing it with blue. And I'm going to start this section by distinguishing between selective reflection and selective transmission. And usually when we're talking about what we perceive of colors in the world, what we are perceiving, or the colors of objects, it's mostly determined by the wavelengths that are being reflected by the object. So some of the wavelengths are being absorbed and other wavelengths are being reflected. And it's the wavelengths that are being reflected that influence the color. that we perceive. And it's important to distinguish between chromatic colors or hues, which I'll try to call hues, but I tend to call them colors, but they are different than achromatic colors, where the chromatic colors are what we perceive as, the colors, the Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, and so forth. All of those other colors that we talk about are really hues, where some wavelengths are being reflected more than others. Some wavelengths are being absorbed more than others, and that is selective reflection. That is, again, our perception of the hues. Achromatic colors occur, so when we get from black to different shades of gray to white, those are achromatic colors, or colors without color, really, is chroma. But that is when whatever illuminant is beaming down on an object, it's reflected similarly across the full spectrum. And I'm going to show some reflectance curves to make all this a little bit more tangible. So I think the reflectance curves make this all make more sense in my head. So that's why I go through all of these. So I'm going to go through all of these. If we look at a tomato that's nice and red, it's going to be reflecting those longer wavelengths, especially up above about 600, 610, 620 nanometers. If we look at a yellow pigment, it's going to be reflecting quite a bit more of the spectrum than that. Usually and most likely, this is one example. There's going to be a mix. It's not going to be what would be the rainbow yellow would be a single wavelength being reflected at right around 570, let's say 580 nanometers. But what's happening is we're reflecting those medium and long wavelengths as the yellow pigment, and then not so much the short wavelengths. Green pigment is going to have its peak. It's going to reflect the most at 500 nanometers, and it's going to have some other wavelengths being reflected right around that, but not so much of the really short and not really any of the really long wavelengths. And then the blue pigment is going to be reflecting short wavelengths and not really the medium and longer wavelengths at all, so that we can get down to the blue. And if you'll notice the achromatic colors, so we compare black to gray to white there, the black is absorbing most of the wavelengths and reflecting very little, but reflecting about the same amount across the electromagnetic spectrum. A gray card, as we're getting into lighter and lighter shades of gray, we're going to move that percentage of what's being reflected up and up and up, and again, about evenly across the spectrum. And white paper is going to be reflecting a great deal, probably something like 80%, 85%, 90% of the light, but it's going to be, again, across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And I distinguish this from selective reflectance, what we're used to talking about with objects and so forth, from selective transmission, which we also do see. We have sometimes wavelengths are passing through an object or a substance, where there's some transparency to the substance that the wavelengths are passing through. So liquids, if you have your orange soda or a cranberry juice or whatever that has some color to it, what the color is the wavelengths that are passing through that substance and being refracted. And then plastics, glass, I always like to pick up sea glass, so whether it's green or brown or whatever color the glass is, that is wavelengths that are passing through that substance. And usually I do a short little thing with demo kind of thing with color, where we get small bottles of water that I keep reusing the bottles and then filling them with water, and then students will use food coloring to create colors. And it allows us to go through a couple of concepts very nicely. So I'm going to try to remember later on to remind you to do that and to think through some of the concepts. So you might want to go ahead, get a small bottle of water or a bottle, refill something with water, a little bit of water, and just use some food coloring and create a color or two. Really would be better. And we're going to come back to that. The other aspect to really understanding how we are perceiving color then is to go back into talking about the cones, right? So that we have these short wavelength cones that are absorbing light the best, right around 419 nanometers. Medium wavelength cones that are absorbing light the best, right around 531 nanometers, and then long wavelength cones that are absorbing light the best, right around 558 nanometers. But what you can see is they all have these almost normal looking curves where they're absorbing light the best. So we're looking at the relative proportion of light that is absorbed. They're absorbing light the best at these particular wavelengths, but they are absorbing light at other wavelengths that we just see this kind of drop off. And so the way we see the or the range of colors that we see is by looking at the ratios of these three cones, of how much they are firing relative to one another.